Hello everyone and welcome to this lesson which we'll be talking about troubleshooting Windows startup problems. Well, before we get to actually any type of problems, we're first going to learn about the boot process from the time you press the power button until the Windows desktop loads with your operating system. We're also going to learn about some of the Windows tools that can help when solving various Windows startup problems. And lastly, we'll cover a little bit about how to learn how to troubleshoot Windows startup problems. Well, the first thing we're going to talk about is understanding the actual boot up process and the difference between what a hard boot and a soft boot really is. Now, most of us techie people use the terms boot and startup interchangeably. However, in general term, the boot refers to the actual hardware phase of starting up a computer. Now, Microsoft, in its infinite wisdom, consistently uses the term startup to refer to how its operating system is booted. Well, guess we can just say how it's started. Anyway, booting refers to the computer bringing itself up to a working state without the user having to do anything but simply press the on button on their computer. And we use more terms here interchangeably. What's known as a hard boot, we also call that a cold boot, and that actually involves turning on the computer with the power on-off switch. Whereas we have a soft boot or a warm state boot, this involves using the operating system to simply do a reboot by clicking on the start button and selecting restart. Now, another difference between these two is that a hard boot is going to take more time because the soft boot, when we use that, the initial steps of a hard boot simply don't happen. So to save time, you should go ahead and do a soft boot to restart your computer as a general practice. When we use a hard boot, it's going to initialize the computer's processor and it's going to clear the memory. Where if a soft boot doesn't work, you want to make sure that you definitely do a restart and just do a hard boot, because a hard boot will take care of any of those problems that might be occurring. And sometimes when you try to do a soft boot, the computer simply doesn't respond and you are left with no option but to do a hard boot using the on-off button on the front of your computer, or even tripping the power button on the rear of the case of your computer if you're using a desktop and not a laptop. Obviously, if you're using a laptop, you simply just need to hold the power button on your computer down for a certain amount of time until you see that the operating system clears off of your screen and that you are now in a state where you need to press the power button one more time to perform that hard boot, where the computer will initialize the processor and clear the memory. After that point, you should see your operating system start to load after it performs the BIOS tests. And that term should seem familiar to you with the term BIOS. The startup BIOS is responsible, after all, for getting a system up and running. You can recall that the startup BIOS is a programming that's contained on the firmware chip on the motherboard that once again is responsible for getting your system up and running after it performs some tests. The startup BIOS reads the motherboard settings and runs the post or power on self-test. Now, when you run the startup BIOS and the power on self-test, which occurs from the BIOS, the BIOS is going to read some information that's stored, such as an inventory of your hardware devices, those settings for that hardware, any type of security password you've put in, the date and time, of course, and different startup settings. Now, the post, once again I'll say that, is the power on self-test. This is a series of tests used to find out if the startup BIOS can communicate correctly with all the essential hardware components required for your computer to have a successful boot. One of the most important parts, of course, of the startup BIOS is that it's going to search for a bootable device on your computer so that it can boot and load that operating system so that you have the GUI in front of you to be able to do those day-to-day functions that you wish to perform. Now, if you start up your system and you press the correct key on your keyboard as designated, you can bring up your BIOS system. And you can see here's our startup BIOS screen as an example here. A lot of times when you press the delete button, or it might be a certain function key, you will see a screen very similar to this. This is the BIOS setup menu screen. You can use different menus and items on these type screens to verify your hardware device is recognized by your system, enable or disable certain devices. Obviously, you can set the date and time here. You can set some early startup security passwords to the computer here. You can obviously change your boot order, which you will probably find yourself doing frequently throughout your career, as well as make other BIOS setting changes here as well. Now, a little note about the boot order. As we are seeing, more and more manufacturers are doing away with optical media, so you will probably see over the next couple of years that a BIOS will start to change where your optical drives are no longer an option, or they will be set to a very low priority if they are maintained there, because as we are moving into a full implementation of Windows 10 as well as future operating systems, the optical media manufacturers are making less and less media available. We'll be doing everything based off of ISOs. So I'm sure you will see this come in the near future where, if you haven't already noticed, we're not really using optical drives for much of anything in our current technology. There are various files and components that are necessary to start our Windows operating systems. We'll take a look at Windows 7 and Vista. There's not a whole lot of difference between earlier or later, actually, more current operating systems, but we just want to introduce some of these terms here, as you will probably see some of these on your CompTIA exams. The first one we want to talk about is the master boot record, or MBR. This is the first sector of the hard drive. We call this the master boot record, and it contains the partition table and the master boot program that's used to locate and start up the boot manager program. Another one is the first sector of the system partition, which in typical systems you will see that is your C drive, represented by a C, uppercase C and a colon. This is our OS boot record. And XP uses a sector if you're using an old Windows XP system, but Windows 7 and Vista do not use it. So with the CompTIA exam, if you have a question about this for XP systems, which as we all know is a legacy system now as it was put to sunset already, that use the OS boot record, but not with later operating systems. Here's a list of some of those other components or files. You can see we have the boot manager listed here. The path for this is obviously the root directory of your main system partition, which, as I said before, is usually your C colon. The Windows Boot Manager manages your initial startup of your Windows operating system. Some of the other ones we have listed here are winload.exe. This, as most of these important system files is located in the system32 file, and this loads and starts essential window processes. We also have the Windows kernel, ntso kernel.exe. Once again, this is load in the system32, and as you recall, the kernel is where we a lot of times see when we have issues. This is why we get our blue screen of death errors. Another important one we'll talk about here is the system registry hive. As you recall from the registry, that area we try to keep all of our users out of, and that even we ourselves are very careful when working with. The system registry hive in the system32 folder in the configuration folder, that holds the data for our HKey local machine key for our registry. Very important area. And of course, it's hard to have any type of communication with our system and our devices without knowing the area, and BIOS is going to check our device drivers, and that is located in our Windows System32 drivers folder. And these are drivers that are, as I said, are required for communication between the system and our devices. I want to share a quick little flowchart here. Just kind of this represents the steps to booting the computer and loading our Windows operating system. You can see how right away we see exactly what we just talked about. BIOS checks the essential hardware using the post test. And if we use our flowchart here, it says, well, did any type of error occur? Well, yes. Okay. Is our video card active? You know, we got some things to check here. If no errors occurred, all right, check the CMOS, find our operating system, launch our master boot record, load the boot manager, read our BCD files, and we have different types of boots here. Normal startup, do we have more than one operating system? Are we going to do a dual boot? We have all kinds of different features. So This is just a really good representation of those steps that get our computer up and running. And once we turn over our startup to our operating system kernel, well, you can see we have some operations that occur as well here. And the kernel will go through all of this, and you can see lastly, as we get to the bottom here, are there any group policies that need to be enforced before we actually hand over everything to our user and let them have control.